Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Reckoning with Very Real Conversations. My name is Jennifer Coleman. I'm part of the conference planning team with Manifest Creative, and I will be your host for this session. We also have Kevin from the AV team joining us to make sure everything runs smoothly. This session was pre-recorded, so after the presentation, we will do live Q&A. So you can drop your questions into the Q&A box in Whova while the presentation is rolling, and we will get to those after the video is complete. And before we get started, just a couple of other housekeeping items to mention. The Whova platform will be open for 3 months after the conference ends, so you will be able to access the videos and other session materials later. Every session does also have a link to a virtual whiteboard with virtual sticky notes called Jamboard. And we'll be using this for kind of informal feedback on each session. And then Alex and Maurice, our conference chair, will be referring to those for the closing reflection session on Friday. There is also a formal session evaluation. You can find that with the Rate the Session button underneath the video window in Whova. And also don't forget to check out our sponsors and exhibitors in Whova while you're here. They've been great supporters of this conference. And speaking of sponsors, we would like to thank our sponsor, Erin McClelland from MuseWork, for sponsoring this session and invite her to share a few comments with you all before we get started. Erin?
Thank you, Jennifer. I know some of you, but for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Erin McClelland, and I'm the Director of Operations and co-owner of MuseWork, an exhibit planning and design firm here in Austin, Texas. When MuseWork was presented with the opportunity to sponsor this session, we leapt at it because, like all the rest of you who've chosen to attend today, we know that we have a lot of work we need to do in this area. Our presenters today are Ms. Margaret Cook, Director of the Bullock Texas State History Museum, Dr. Kefrelyn Brown, Professor and Distinguished University Teaching Professor of Cultural Studies at UT Austin, Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry, the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at UT Austin, and Ms. Rachel E. Winston, Black Diaspora Archivist at UT Austin. I am deeply appreciative of their willingness to share their expertise and experiences with us today, and grateful to TAM for hosting this session. Thank you for giving us all this opportunity to learn from you and improve our own work.
Thank you, Erin. And now we will start the video.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Our discussion today is a hybrid format. This first half has been taped in advance and the Q&A will be live, so as you have questions or examples to share from your own experiences, please type them in the chat. In 1960, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in You Learn by Living, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. I'm Margaret Cook, Director of the Bullock Texas State History Museum and President of TAM, and I'm honored to be here with 3 outstanding professionals, Dr. Berry, the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at UT Austin, Dr. Brown, Professor and Distinguished University Teaching Professor of Cultural Studies and Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas, Austin, with faculty appointments in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the John L. Field Center for African and African American Studies, and the Center for Women and Gender Studies, and Ms. Rachel Winston, activist, curator, and Black diaspora activist with E.S. Benson Latin American Studies and Collections. This topic for today's session discussion has been moving through museum circles for decades. In fact, I was just reading an earlier article in Toolkit published by TAM in 1995 that said the same thing. Perhaps that is indicative that this is a process. The challenge, the relevancy, the importance, and impetus for us to connect the past to the present to create a healthier future for our communities is not a product that has a shelf life. It is evolutionary and continuous. Dr. Brown will be leading us through key discussion questions, and we'll be sharing our experiences from 3 different but very interdependent perspectives as they pertain to museums and exhibitions: that of archivist and curator, that of senior administrator, and that of the historian, consultant, or consumer audience. So let's begin. Dr. Brown, I turn it over to you.
Hello, welcome to everyone who's here and joining us today, and I'm glad to be a part of this wonderful panel. I'm going to start by sharing a question, and I'll ask each of the presenters to respond. The first question is, how do museums engage and address uncomfortable subjects like slavery, race, and white supremacy? And maybe we can begin with Dr. Berry.
So I would love to start off, but I think it would be good to hear from an archivist perspective. And I'm wondering if Ms. Winston would like to respond first. And then I'd be happy to say my remarks in a few minutes.
Certainly. So for me, coming from the collections documentation, both outward facing documentation and inward facing, I think a lot of this question does get to the work that we as cultural heritage and museum workers do that is public engaging, that does engage the public and is public facing, but there's a significant part that does face inward that we need to be aware of. So documentation can look different depending on the institution, whether it's a finding aid, a description in our collections management systems, internal databases, really making sure that the words and the language we use are accurate, that they represent the people and the subjects that are being discussed in a way that is careful. And so, as you know, we're all human. We bring our prejudice and our biases to the work that we do, even as professionals. Our predecessors are the same. And so this is really ongoing work. Not only making sure our description in this current moment is right, but oftentimes revisiting legacy description and doing reparative work. And what I mean by reparative work is being intentional about making sure that voices that are represented in an artifact, in a collection, in a document are represented in fair and accurate ways. So I can give a brief example to this point. I recently processed a manuscript collection. It was purchased from a private collector. It's a collection of documents detailing court records related to slavery in Mexico. And so the collector provided a wonderful inventory, much of which I was able to use, which made my life a lot easier, right? But I did make some editorial changes to the language that was used, particularly in speaking about the enslaved people that were mentioned. So, for example, an original sentence might read something along the lines of, a 34 mulatto man named John was sold. But in my editing, it was changed to read, John, a 34-year-old enslaved man was sold, really centering the humanity of the people that we're talking about. So the great thing about descriptive work is that so many of us are already engaged in it on a pretty regular basis. So that work can begin now.
Thank you. And would you like to go next, Mark?
Sure. And picking up on what Rachel said first, our work in the museum on the floor and exhibitions and programs wouldn't be possible without the work that the curators and archivists and even collections managers are doing at that front end, because it's those finding aids that help us dissect what is available for us to have these teaching moments in the exhibitions for our audiences. From an administrator's perspective, a lot of that groundwork is really critical in making sure that all the stakeholders are on board. And by stakeholders in this case, I mean not as much the audience, but those who are providing funding, those who might also be critical of such efforts or feel that they don't have a place within your particular museum, you as an administrator have to have the answers to help them move forward in the discussion, especially when you're dealing with difficult and challenging subjects like white supremacy or how we talk about people who were enslaved. And Rachel had a great point in that people first language. And that isn't just important in the record, but it's important in the label copy. It's important in how you use images on the floor. And it's very important in how administrators talk and refer to things when they are making the case. Always, always, always put people first in your language with whomever you're talking about. It really changes that dynamic and brings that humanity, as Rachel said. And then I would say one of our biggest obstacles is often fear of repercussion. And so one of the techniques I use with our team at the Bullock, and that they've become very adept with, is asking yourself the question, what is the worst thing can happen if you follow through with the story you want to tell? Put together the frequently asked questions. Why are you doing it? Making sure that your motivation is honorable. You're not just jumping on a bandwagon, but you really believe in what you're doing. And that makes a huge difference just in preparing and giving confidence to the team, but also in how the response will be from the public as well. You'll be able to deal with those issues that might come up once you do have something on the floor.
Thank you so much. And Dinah, would you like to respond?
Sorry, I switched the order. I was thinking about it from the perspective of a consumer and a consultant, and that's how I've engaged museums. And so I was thinking it would be nice for them to speak first. So thank you for allowing me to do that. So from my perspective, I have encountered issues, uncomfortable subjects like race and slavery and white supremacy because I teach it. So it's not necessarily an uncomfortable subject or topic for me. It's the work that I do on a daily basis. But it's really different when I enter a museum space in a museum setting and I see how those organizations address those same topics. And it does not necessarily always reflect the current historical literature. And so I think for me, I'm happy when I'm asked to work with a museum, when a museum is interested in retelling the story or changing their labels or asking questions about the way something is displayed or how it's placed and what else should be in that space. Those are really, really important questions because it helps how users and visitors engage whatever the museum is attempting to teach in that moment. So from my perspective, I don't know that we're at a place, honestly, I don't know that we're at a place on how to address issues of slavery and white supremacy. I think we're being forced to. And I think that we're in a moment where we have to think about how we talk about it. And we are in a very divided space in this nation right now. And so there are some places where people are not even comfortable using the term white supremacy. And some people are rejecting the even notion of it. So how do we then present that in a museum space? How do we present that in an exhibition and show, as Rachel said, multiple perspectives and as both of you said, acknowledge the humanity and the personhood of the people that you're talking about. One way is really to show from different angles. I think, because then the user experience that will allow different visitors to connect with the material. And that's one way that I see it. So you might have, and it may not be the same political view or economic view, or it may not even come from a perspective that you agree with, but it's showing the variety of our thinking in this nation, the variety of the ways in which we've encountered history. But if I were to consult on projects related to slavery, which I have, I am always about enslaved people and about their humanity and not objectifying them and recognizing that enslaved people had thoughts and feelings and emotions, and they had opinions about how they were treated. And if we just judge the way we present them from the perspective of the enslaver, then we miss an aspect of the experience that is often undertold or not necessarily acknowledged. And so how do we do it if we don't have records from the enslaved, which we do, but we may not have records to tell that particular story at your particular museum, right? And one way to do that is to ask questions. Ask questions of the material, even if you don't have the answer, because your viewers will be coming to that space and some of them will be asking those same questions. And it will be comforting for them to think, okay, I was wondering the same thing, or I wanted to know why that was this way. Even if you can't answer it, I think it's important to engage and engage history. I also think it's okay for museums to upgrade, revise, and revisit even their own, I was going to say traveling, but not even the traveling exhibitions, because those are easy to change. But I'm saying the permanent things that are in part of the permanent collection, there's ways where you can make changes to it. Sarah Bond from the University of Iowa, she wrote about this in an article about how there was a museum, and I think it was in Massachusetts. I can't remember the name of the museum right now, but they made changes. They had a permanent collection of the history of people in that region. And what they did was they added labels that talked about them, these same people, as enslavers and how much money they made off of enslaved people's bodies, as rather than saying this is the judge and this is the police officer and this is the, this great outside citizen. Yes, that's who they were, but they were also owning enslaved people. And what they did next to these labels was included the names of enslaved people that they own, the ages, and whatever stories they could. That added and made for a much richer experience for those visiting. And I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the museum right now, but that's just one example, I think, of how we can address and make changes and keep up with current literature. And it's not easy to do, but I think even having a team of scholars to come in and work with museum professionals, because there are a number of scholars that want to do that kind of work and are happy to do it. So I'll start with that.
Great, thank you all. So picking up on this theme of how do we sort of engage difficult topics, or topics that some people, in particular our public, might find difficult, how do you then engage visitors who are coming into the museum without alienating some or offending others, which seems like a sort of delicate balance in a way that you have to consider. Would you like to start with this question, Margaret?
Sure. Yes, of course. Thank you. So I think the truth here is that no matter what subject you're dealing with on the floor or in a program in a museum, there is always the possibility that someone is not going to like it or someone is going to be offended. And again, it comes back to what was your motivation for doing it in the first place? Are you committed to the subject? Do you have your answers for those critiques that come up? I remember hearing from one of our staff at one point where they were talking with a visitor who just come out of this incredible Butterflies IMAX movie that we had, right, about monarch migration. And the individual said, oh, it was beautiful until that part that they started talking about evolution, and then it lost me, right? Well, from our perspective, evolution is science, and there's no question about that. But here is an individual who was having a good experience up until there was something that they, for whatever reasons, did not agree with. So my point there is that always happens. It could be the most benign in your thinking event or program or exhibition, and yet someone will have had their perspective challenged and be uncomfortable with that, and so they might voice that. So you have to be ready for that. People are people, they're very human, they're coming from different perspectives, as Dr. Berry had said, and it's important to recognize that. It's also important to recognize that among your own staff who are working on a project, there might not be a unified voice. And as an administrator or facilitator for that team, it is important to be able to pull them together and keep them focused on the main mission of what you're doing and why you're doing it. I can think of a particular example where the Bullock Museum had the opportunity to put a Grand Dragon robe from the Dallas area on view. It was on loan from a family who really had found it, had no idea of their family history, didn't want anything to do with the robe, wanted to donate it, but we don't accept donations. We are all based on loaned objects from other places. So all based on relationships, truthfully, in terms of what goes on the floor. And we debated for a while the pros and cons of putting this on. And we even knew that there were some of our volunteers who weren't going to go into the room where the robe was going to be. So we did a lot of prepping. We did a lot of prepping with the staff. We did a lot of conversations with our executive leadership to make sure that this was going to help us tell the story that we wanted it to tell. And then we combined it with a story about the Klan's effect and their role in lynchings within Texas. And we tried at all costs to avoid re-victimization of those who had been lynched. And in concert with that, we were able to present a programming, both teacher training and symposium for folks to look deeper into what it meant to have this presence, particularly at the turn of the century, but also draw connections to the present. And there was great concern that there was going to be significant backlash among our visitors, and the effect was quite the opposite. People understood. There might have been some who were uncomfortable with it, but overall it was used as a teaching experience. And so one of the things that helped with that is we were prepared for every possible question, every possible criticism that would come our way. And it ended up being quite successful without making it sensationalistic.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to take that question?
Sure, thank you. So much of what brings folks through our doors and in these days into our virtual spaces is connection and relationships, just like you were speaking about, Margaret. So much of that motivation to come has to do with seeing yourself, right? Your history, your interests represented in the exhibitions that we're promoting or the collection items that we steward. And so we talked about being careful in describing and sharing information about these items, but I think it's also important not to shy away from the relationship of institution and objects. I've had some really interesting conversations with students in that space. So thinking about provenance and the institution's role in receiving and caring for collection materials, and kind of the implications of that. And this is something that I've seen get better with time, that sense of transparency, institutions talking about things that were donated, things that were purchased, even explicitly naming the funds that were used to purchase items. But being open to speaking to these issues also can serve as kind of an invitation for folks who may not otherwise know that they themselves could be in relationship with the institution, or people who might have collection items that speak to collections you have or could help round out collection holdings that you might have, complement or help round out your collections to make them more representative. I was recently in a virtual program. A collecting institution was talking about a postcard collection they had in their holdings, and the chat was on fire. People seeing this collection talked about had people thinking in the chat, people talking about their own postcard collections, not only their thoughts about what was being discussed in the presentation, but also the materials they had and how they related. And so just getting folks excited about what you have and building on that connection that they feel to your collection can also engage them in new ways.
Thank you. And Dinah, would you like to respond?
Sure. I think I would basically agree with everything that both Rachel and Margaret said in terms of programming, and also having public events, presentations, and talks. I think also guided tours where you can bring in experts to come and lead different groups through that material. But one of the ways you can address programming would be to have, when we talked about multiple perspectives, having different nights focus on different perspectives of that particular exhibition. And that would be one way to engage the local community or even a community beyond that, where people might want to come because of a particular speaker or because the fact that it's connecting themselves to that particular exhibit. So I think those are some of the things. I think also teacher trainings, how teachers, and this was already mentioned, but how teachers can use and engage the material. If you also could provide, and this is not always budgetary, it's not always within budget, but even providing a pamphlet or a brochure, not all exhibits have catalogs, but some kind of brochure that teachers can use back in their classrooms, or even images of documents, or if there's a companion website, that's another way to engage, which I think is a wonderful way to address when you may not have the space to do it, but also making sure your docents are well trained, so that the docents that are participating in those conversations, that are leading it, that are leading visitors through the space, that they're prepared and that they've done whatever readings you want them to have, maybe even having a workshop with the docents prior to opening exhibition, which I know that often happens, but just empowering them to feel comfortable, and even having them practice some of the things that they might want to share when they engage the exhibit. I think those are some of the ways, but also, to be real frank, is to just address the controversial, difficult topics, the elephants in the room up front, because half the people that are either on the tours or looking are thinking it, and just address it right away. And then one thing that I don't know what other professionals on this panel would feel, but for me, I like going to museums where there's public comments. You see the Post-its. It can get kind of messy and they fall off the wall and they're on the floor. But is there some way to even use electronic ways of, as Rachel was just describing, the chat? Like, is there a way to put like a digital board next there with information on people's feedback or comments? It'd be really, I enjoy seeing how other people engage the particular collection or a particular exhibit. And so I sometimes read those comments at the end. I was like, oh, I didn't think that, or I didn't feel that, or I didn't recognize that. I need to go back. I didn't see that particular part of the exhibit. So I think those are some of the ways that I would engage and deal with and address programming in these spaces.
That's great. Thank you. So let's go to our final question, which links up with what Dinah was just speaking about. What types of programs then do you think add depth to these conversations? And in my mind, as I've been listening to you all talk, I'm thinking about these exhibits, these kinds of exhibits, as a type of curriculum in a lot of ways. We're educating others, and helping to broaden the way that people think about the work, think about whatever it is that we're sharing in the museum. So what kind of programming do you think can deepen the experience, the learning experience, and the exposure that our visitors at museums have? And I guess we can start with Rachel.
Sure. So there is so much opportunity in creating programming to involve and engage community stakeholders in the planning and the processes of creating programming events. So many opportunities that I think we haven't even explored them all as a profession. It's really important to stay mindful of the fact that while we may maintain custody of the physical object or items, we don't certainly have all the knowledge and context for these. So any programming or events are just made more complete with the input and equitable involvement of community members and those who are most at stake with these collections. And this can be uncomfortable, right? Especially a lot of our institutions have workflows and checklists and ways about doing things that don't necessarily include outreach and involving people outside of the institution in these processes, but it can be done. I have been working currently on an online exhibition, partnering with a collecting institution in the Caribbean, and it's been a really collaborative experience. And so this is certainly, I'm kind of reinventing some of my institution's workflows in doing that, but it's just such an important step. So to be, give an example, I made sure that, so as we were sharing information and items and ideas on how this exhibition would take shape, when the first draft of all of the exhibition text was finished, I sent it to their team to review before it even went to the editors to view. So making sure that everybody is on board and feels good about things has been important, in getting their input on how things will look, knowing that I may be the main point of contact at my institution, but I'm certainly not the only person who should have their hands on this work. So there's so much possibility to engage our larger community in the work that we do, and help folks, again, see themselves represented in these spaces and tell their friends and their networks about it, to just increase our reach.
Sorry, thank you so much. And Margaret.
Just second what Rachel has said, and that collaboration is really important, because I don't think that there's any of us out there who are leading or working within an institution that thinks that we have all the answers, right? So you need to go outside of yourself and make those connections. And sometimes it's going to take time. You want to build up trust, especially if maybe before your time at an institution, there wasn't trust built up within the community or within the greater community that you could be serving. So you want to make sure that you're allowing enough time to gain that trust and to really listen to what your advisors and consultants are saying. But I think those collaborative programs that we can develop are really good. The teacher training, where you bring in experts who can help teachers gain confidence in talking in their classrooms about enslavement and the horrors that came with it, but also how it, in Texas's place, how it actually not only put money in the pockets of other individuals, but built up Texas as well, right? So it's one of those foundations in the state that we have to address and we have to confront, and pay equitably for those services. You're bringing people in who are, unless they're already on your board or they're volunteering, and you have a longstanding relationship with them, please budget accordingly and pay equitably for their services. They're professionals, they've trained, they know what they're doing, and they deserve that. The other thing that you can do is start, as Rachel was saying, with that object, right? When you have a written document that lays out exactly why a slaveholder was operating in the way that they were, use that. That's irrefutable evidence, especially if you know the provenance, if you've got all of that background information. Start with that object and that artifact. That's one thing museums can do differently and better than anyone else, because that's where our educational learning points are. And if you think how we learn and we're able to educate by creating empathy, what are the ways in which you can engage the senses in order to do that? So tactile experiences, or those virtual experiences where you are really listening as well as presenting. And the one caution that I would make is, if you're contemplating a reenactment of some sort, you've probably seen press recently where there have been perhaps good intentions on the part of a teacher or a museum, that, they thought, well, we'll create empathy by doing this reenacting of whatever. That has a lot of pitfalls to it, and you want to proceed very cautiously there. I would suggest some other kind of tactile experience might be better, as opposed to doing a reenactment of something, because you have the potential to victimize anew, to bring out biases or prejudices that people are not able to handle, either in themselves or in someone else. So I would, particularly if you're a novice at this, I would stay away from those kinds of things. There are a great many other ways to, as Dr. Berry was saying, great many other ways in which you can engage people and at multiple levels so that you're reaching them with the programming that you're doing. And then the last thing I would say is, do not think that the age of your audience is a obstacle in terms of approaching teaching about slavery or white supremacy or biases. Because I will tell you, kids, from very early ages are already experiencing racism. And so they need to have the vocabulary in which they can talk about that and share and grow. And so kids are much often more able to handle difficult subjects than adults can be in terms of talking about it freely and asking those questions. So while you want to make sure that your programming is geared towards different age levels, again, that's where your experts and your consultants can come in to help you with that.
Great, thank you so much. And Dinah, do you have anything to share?
Just a few,
to this question.
yeah, thank you. Just a few things to add on to what I said earlier and what both was just said now. One of the things I think with program that's useful is to, if you're looking at the history of slavery, to see if there's a descendant community around in the area, because that's one of the most offensive things that an institution can do, is ignore family members on both sides, both the enslaved and the enslavers, to see how they want, the formerly enslavers, to see how they want to engage or how they feel about, and maybe some of these family members want to come speak. They might have other family stories to share that would really enrich and enhance the exhibition. So I think looking for the descendant community, particularly of the enslaved, because their voices have often been overlooked, and we're often using records from slaveholding families to tell the stories of the enslaved. So I think that's one thing. If you have, I would also encourage, like, if you have a particular object or a set of documents, I would even go beyond what you have to then round out the story. So you might have, and like Margaret was saying with the tactile, there may be music that you want to have as part of that, or even engaging local schools so that they can do a class project on that particular exhibition, so that the students would then contribute to the way in which that exhibition is being shared within the community. That's one thing. Also, with slavery, when I say adding other things, we have legislation. I think that's a really powerful way to teach about the history of slavery, because many people have questions. Well, why didn't enslaved people resist, or why didn't they rebel? As if they didn't, but they ask these types of questions. And I think giving the legislation, the demographics of the community really are important. If you're sharing a particular document or a series of things about a plantation or plantation community, then allow the students and the viewers to understand the wider community that material comes from. I think that context will really matter, and it will allow for a more enriched experience there. I think that was all I wanted to share for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for responding to these pointed questions. We now have gotten to a point in the presentation where we'd like to just give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts that you might have about the topic of dealing with real and difficult conversations in museums. Is there anything that you'd like to add to the conversation? And maybe I'll start with Rachel.
So I do want to first just highlight a point that Margaret made, because it is so important, that when you bring in community members and experts, folks from outside of your institution, it's important to pay or compensate them for the work that they do. That can't be understated enough, and to credit their work when it's appropriate as well. I also just want to call out a great resource that's been put online by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, part of the Smithsonian Institution. It's an online toolkit called Talking About Race. And that might be helpful for folks as they begin to think about how they will engage this work into what they're doing and start making steps towards that.
Thank you. And Margaret.
Thank you. I want to stress that this is about being relevant and working with your community. This is one more step in the work that we do to make healthier communities and have a role in making that happen. And Rachel used a fantastic term at the very beginning in her answer. This is reparative, right? This is healing. And sometimes before you're fully healed, you have to pour a little bit of antiseptic on a wound and then be able to deal with that pain. That is part of the process. And listen. You have to listen to the people that you are serving, and you don't have to do everything all at once. Sometimes baby steps will get you to where you want to be. This is, as I said at the beginning, as we're seeing a process by which we grow stronger and more inclusive and more representative of what our full history actually is.
Great. And Dinah, would you like to have the final word on?
I really
on
shouldn't
this
be the
topic?
one with the final word here, but mine was just simple. I was going to go back to something I said in the beginning. As you're thinking about addressing various topics at your institution, that there are lots of scholars across the country that would be happy to consult, to contribute, to review material. And much of what I hear is, well, we don't know who to contact, we don't know where to find them. You can do a few things. The first is you can contact your local universities and colleges and see if in various departments, depending on what the exhibit is about, and see if they have recommendations. But if you're looking at historical exhibits, there are professional organizations like the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and they have a series of distinguished lecturers. And they do, if you look at that website for the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectures, you can book them for talks based on various topics. And I'm sure that there's oftentimes someone that can speak on the subject that you're preparing an exhibit for. Also, social media is one way. If a museum, people read social media, as you know, people are very engaged, actively engaged in social media. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever your site of preference is. But you could also put a question, say we're preparing an exhibit on this. Any scholars? Can anybody recommend a scholar? You'll be surprised at how many people will probably send you names or you'll hear from. So just from the perspective of the academic community, there are a lot of us that want to participate, that want to help and want to support, and we're here as a service and would appreciate being compensated either financially or acknowledged in the exhibition somewhere to show, so that we can put that on our CVs and that we can show that we've done public facing work to our academic community. Thank you.
So thank you all so much for engaging in this conversation, an important conversation that I hope, and I think we all hope, will really impact in a positive way the work that museum curators and that are doing this work every day. Listening to what you all had to say, what really struck me is the idea that this work is intentional. It has to be intentional and it needs to be thoughtful. And it's really important to think about the sort of reasons why one wants to do this work and what they're wanting to present. And to even think about how the various communities that will encounter it. That's important. It's also very important for us to consider communities that are impacted by the work that we're doing, to include them and to give them the respect that they should have in doing that work, but also partnering with others. This is not work that we can turn a blind eye to. We have to do it. So thank you all so much for giving us some really great advice and even some experiences with doing this work so that others can follow.
All right, well, we appreciate everyone listening to this taped dialogue, and we're going to go live now into the questions in the chat. And when we do that, I want to leave you with one more quote, and this is from Jane Addams. She wrote, "To do what you are afraid to do is to guide your life by fear. How much better not to be afraid to do what you believe in doing." So if you believe in this work, we hope that this is the start or the continuation of tools and skills that you can build in order to do this. So let's go now and see what questions and examples you might have from your own experiences. Thanks so much. All right, everyone, thank you for listening to the taped presentation. You are welcome to add your questions into Whova, and Jennifer will feed them to me so I can have our panelists respond. It has been such an honor to be on this panel, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Berry and Rachel and Dr. Brown to have said yes when we put out the call. I have been struck by the thread within the overall conference and in the kinds of things that keep being repeated, and repetition often is a good thing that sticks with us. So I hope that you have found some good takeaways from this. You can also, if you like, unmute yourself and jump into the conversation. I'm not seeing any questions coming in from Whova right now, but this is a good place to get your burning questions, or as Dr. Brown had said at one point, sharing types of programming that you have done that has been successful for your institution and that you feel like you've made some progress in. We would absolutely love to hear that and highlight your work as well. So I'll just take a look at the screen here and see if there's anything that's coming in.
You have shy audience members.
We've been putting a lot of thought-filled content in their brains, I think. So
They're processing.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. So how do you respond to the revisionist history people who push back on telling the full story? Who would like to tackle that?
I'll start. So that's a great question. My first response is that we are constantly revising history. We're not changing the facts of history, but we're changing the way we think and talk about it because we gain new information and insights from different documents that weren't available 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We might have records that have surfaced, or families have donated papers that make us think about a moment in history differently. So I would embrace, make sure I understand the question, but I would embrace the idea of telling the full story and being okay with making changes to the way history is presented, primarily because we learn more and more every single year. We learn more whenever material is donated, as I mentioned. Pushing back against that, though, I think the question was about revisionist historians who don't want the history to change. Is that correct?
It's about response to those who are pushing back on telling the full story because they think what we may mean by the full story is actually revising history.
Oh, no, yeah. So the full
revising
story,
their understanding of history, right? But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the challenge for that, and I'm sure my other panelists would want to say something too, but the challenge about that is that oftentimes the pushback is because the story that people are comfortable with was not the full story. And so when you have these other ways of interpreting or understanding a moment or an event, for some people that's very uncomfortable because that's not how I learned it, or that's not what I read. But that's why I always say that it's wonderful to keep up with the latest literature, and most scholars, we are required to write based on the documents. We are required to write based on not only documents, but objects and other artifacts. And so we are constantly learning more about the past. And I think, I would hope that museums would be welcoming to make minor adjustments as well.
Great. Rachel or Dr. Brown, did you want to jump in on that at all?
Dr. Berry really said what needed to be said on that one. I will just kind of double down on a point, one of the last points you made, Dr. Berry, that letting documents speak. A lot of times that's really all you need to do is put it out there. Sometimes with some interpretation, sometimes they don't need much interpretation, but really letting those pieces stand alone and guide the stories we're trying to tell.
Great. So here's one. We've begun conversations around equity, accessibility, and inclusion as a staff. What advice and guidance can you share to help us have the conversation with the museum's trustees, many of whom are not accustomed to having challenging, difficult conversations as a board?
Okay, I'll jump in. I thought maybe Rachel or Margaret, you would say something because this is your wheelhouse. But I think it's all about educating. And I really do think that maybe the board members, the executive board, I think was, they might need to be educated on, like, presenting it to them delicately and saying, okay, these are some things that have come up, and maybe doing a presentation so that they understand the issues that are at stake, and having some testimonials. I know people often are moved by personal testimonials, whether it's from school-age children that might say, this is what was striking, or someone that's coming from a particular group that's been marginalized. Maybe the board hearing from them directly might open up their minds to be welcoming to other perspectives. That's my first thought, but this is y'all's wheelhouse.
I think you're right. And this question came from Ann Fortescue. And there are some boards, if you're entering a position, you're relatively new in it, you're executive director and you're working with the trustees, and they're also your oversight and your level of authority, it can be just that conversation can be a difficult conversation to even approach that. But I love your perspective on educating. I think that's really good. We have a question from a docent in training who's been looking for example narratives and language to use on tours. And she has been feeling panicky about saying the wrong thing or saying something in the wrong way. And we mentioned that the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture has a good resource. Are there other sources for narratives that she can look at? I know from my experience, Sherry, that the American Association for State and Local History has resources as well. And the Cincinnati History Center actually has some really good sources as well. They also are connected with the National Underground Railroad Museum. And so there's a lot of crossover there.
Montpelier also did a series of workshops, maybe about 2 years ago with donors, docents, scholars, and philanthropists about how to talk and teach and write about the history of slavery and difficult topics. And I think they created a guide that's online, and they were trying to start a national conversation about these difficult dialogues. I also think, I don't remember who coined it, but the difficult dialogues, is that through, if you look up difficult dialogues, they are sponsored by another organization. I can't remember if it's American Historical Association, or the Ford Foundation. I can't remember, so don't quote me. But they train people on how to do and how to have these difficult conversations. So that might be another space. And then also writing about slavery. There's a Google Doc that was crowdsourced by a number of scholars that talked about language. But also as a docent, even when you get with your group of people, just meet with them when you're going on a tour and say, look, this is uncomfortable for me, or I'm learning my way through this. And I hope that you'll be patient with me and give me some feedback, but this is how I'm approaching this topic, and I'm learning as I go, and I learn from you as well. I think just that right there should be helpful.
Great.
Can I jump in quickly? That's exactly what I was going to say, Dr. Berry, that transparency. Also, another organization that might be helpful is Teaching Tolerance. They have some really great materials available on their website. And I'm going to kind of jump back and forth here. Dr. Berry, you just mentioned feedback, and to tie that into the previous question about boards, any kind of program survey feedback you get, particularly centered on some of the maybe more diverse or expansive programming that you've done, that direct feedback that you can provide to the board to strengthen your case is definitely worth pursuing.
That's an excellent point, Rachel. Thank you for that. It makes all the difference because it's the audience that you're serving that is telling you what they need and want, and your trustees need to hear that. So last question, and so relevant. So as a historian working in museums, I'm sometimes challenged by community members understanding historical events and stories through contemporary politics. Do you have any tips for how we can best advocate for broad histories without wading into emotionally charged political conversations?
That's a great question. One, having a basic set of making sure there's a baseline understanding of the facts. And I know that's a buzzword now, but the facts of the particular events, and thinking about history as it goes, the arc of history over time and where we are today. So having them understand that we're part of a continuum of change and growth and different things that happen in our lives. And we happen to be resting in a very interesting place in our history now, but giving them the foundation to understand that these moments are often moments or flashpoints that we've been to before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to kind of continue that thought, I think it's important in the telling of these stories, if they are told in a broad way, to be equitable in the broad telling. And so audience members will see if you're very specific or kind of give more attention to one kind of history in addressing this larger arc than others. And so if you're going to tell a broad story, be committed to telling a broad story and not favoring maybe more popular or maybe even sometimes problematic histories.
Dr. Brown, I wonder if you've used the technique in your classroom teaching, which I think is effective in museums too, of turning the questions, those emotionally charged questions, back on the person asking them. Like, so you obviously feel very strongly about this. Why is that? And turning your listening earphones back on again. Is that a technique that might be useful in this situation?
Yes, that could be used. I in general, when I encounter pushback, and sometimes I do get pushback, part of what I try to help my students understand is that what we're learning about, and I teach about issues of race and culture as it relates to schooling. I have to help them understand that what we're learning about this is knowledge. This is, people do research in this area. These are not just opinions. And see, I think sometimes because we're talking about topics like race, and people have personal opinions about them, that they often believe that when they encounter the topic of race in school or through the curriculum, that we're talking about it's just about your own personal belief system. And while your personal belief systems play a really big role in shaping how you enter into those conversations and even what you filter out of those conversations, they don't necessarily provide you a robust framework for understanding the historical context, the sociological context, the political context. And so I always go back to that place and try to help the students realize that this may be emotionally charging to you, either because you've experienced it or just because perhaps you don't believe that it actually exists. But what the stance that we're going to take in this course is that we're going to look at what really deep thinkers and people who spend a lot of time considering these issues and observing these issues and cataloging these issues, what they have to say about what
what we're learning about. And I have found that take is really important, as well as, like Diana mentioned earlier, sharing the documents, sharing, where they can actually see, whatever the phenomena is that we're looking at. So that's sort of one way I think that we can help people to better understand this work, that it's not just something we're pulling out of the sky and, presenting because we think it's our own personal understanding, our own personal story.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all so much for being with us this morning. We obviously could talk about this for a very long time. Keep sharing questions, and we will consider those for future topics for TAM. Thank you all to my co-presenters. Love you all, and so appreciative of your work, and hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone. Thank you.